Hi, my name is Latrenda Knighten from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where I'm currently the mathematics supervisor. And at the end of October, I will be the president elect for the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. Thanks for joining me today for Who's Talking in Math class, using instructional routines as a tool to facilitate student understanding of math content and language. So, to get started, I want you to take a look at this prompt on the screen. It says, if math were an animal, what kind of animal would it be? So, if you have paper and pencil around, or if you just want to put something in your head, think about the first word that comes to mind when you hear that question. I want to share with you two responses from second grade students. One student said, if math were an animal, it would be a cow because it's hard to understand and it stares at you. A second student said, if math were an animal, it would be a dog because it can't wait to get to you. So I'm sure you can tell from these responses from these second graders that even as early as second grade, these students have some preconceived notions maybe about what math might be or could be. So our goal is to make sure that our students don't think that math is some dog that's waiting to get to you. And maybe sometimes math might be a little bit hard to understand, but it's not just going to stare at you. We really want to and expose our students to those positive dispositions about mathematics. So, to help us do that, our goals for today are to identify strategies, activities, and resources to help facilitate productive, meaningful discourse in mathematics classrooms, as well as to examine some activities to help students present and explain ideas, reasoning, and explanations in math class. When I think about facilitating meaningful mathematical discourse, the first thing that comes to mind is this quote from NCTM's Principles to Actions. And it says that effective teaching of mathematics facilitates discourse among students to build shared understanding of mathematical ideas by analyzing and comparing student approaches and arguments. So the question becomes, how do we provide opportunities for students to build that shared understanding? So it starts with us thinking about some common things that need to be in place to make sure that we're building that type of community and foundation for those things to occur. Well, we know that mathematical discourse should build on and honor students' thinking. It should also let students share ideas, clarify understandings, and develop convincing arguments. We should engage students in analyzing and comparing student approaches, as well as advance the math learning of the whole class. In order to start this, we have to start with building a community where students know that their ideas are accepted, that they're important, but most importantly, our students embrace what is my role in being a good discourse partner. And that means, especially with our young students, that they understand that part of being a participant in a discussion is knowing that part of your role is to sometimes be an active listener. So here you see some suggestions from a journal article from one of our legacy journals from NCTM, Teaching Children Mathematics. And you see some very simple things that are suggested as steps for active listening. When I was a classroom teacher, I actually took this list and I placed it on colored paper and I laminated it. And so it was at my tables as one of the table tools for my students to use to remind themselves what's my role when I'm engaged in a discussion with my peers. Simple things such as pay attention to the speaker. Show you're listening through verbal and nonverbal cues. Now, those of you who have young students or young children of your own, or just spending time with children, you know that as early as toddler age, children begin to use nonverbal cues when they're having a discussion. A toddler will nod his or her head when they're talking to you or they're mimicking listening. And sometimes they may say, mm-hmm, aha. You know, they're mimicking the things that they've seen adults do. So they start very early learning, what do I need to do to show that I'm listening? So we really just want to help them to fine tune that, reminding them to provide feedback by asking questions or summarizing what the speaker is saying. Allow the speaker to finish before asking questions or stating opinions, and to respond appropriately by being open, honest, and respectful. So that's part of setting up that community that allows our students to know what are their expectations in terms of classroom discourse. And so, for the purpose of our presentation today, we're going to focus on looking at some of those routines that we can use as tools to facilitate discourse. And so, we know that the point of classroom discourse is to develop students' understanding of key ideas. But it's also important that we provide opportunities to emphasize and model mathematical reasoning and problem solving, and to enhance students' disposition toward mathematics. Think about those second graders. What can we do to help them to see the beauty, the wonder, and the joy in mathematics? So, therefore, we know that discourse needs to be planned with these goals in mind, not merely as a checking for understanding form of recitation. This screen shows some sample routines that you probably have utilized in your classroom as well. So we'll talk about some samples that you can use, some examples, and we'll talk about specifically instructional routines and mathematical language routines. So instructional routines are specific and repeatable classroom structures that enable all students to engage more fully in learning opportunities that develop their mathematical thinking and reasoning. A mathematical language routine refers to a structured but adaptable format for amplifying, assessing, and developing students' language. You notice a copyright for Stanford University Center for Assessment, Learning, and Equity. Most of us are familiar with the 8 mathematical language routines that were developed by this group. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to share a bit.ly for resource folder where you can actually get a copy that tells you about each of those 8 routines and provides you with some examples as well. So MLRs are designed to support a variety of language-focused skill growth, from reinforcing mathematical terminology to scaffolding conversations to providing opportunities for students to deepen their conceptual understanding by describing their work. As I mentioned earlier, referenced earlier, there are 8 mathematical language routines identified by this resource. And one of the ones that we're going to uplift right now is number 7, compare and connect. So the purpose of this routine is to focus students' meta awareness as they identify, compare, and contrast different mathematical approaches and representations. This routine leverages the powerful mix of disciplinary representations available in mathematics as a resource for language development. In this routine, students make sense of mathematical strategies other than their own by relating and connecting other approaches to their own. One of my favorite activities to use to uplift this routine is the which one doesn't belong prompts. I hope a lot of you are familiar, you probably have in your own personal library, a copy of this book by Christopher Danielson. And this is a great routine to use in your classroom. So it starts out as a shape book. And so if you don't look very closely, you might think this is just another book about shapes, but that's exactly what it isn't. This is a great problem solving tool. In addition to fostering classroom discourse, it engages students in real mathematical thinking and it helps to build sense making. So those of you who are familiar with this routine, you know that students are presented with the which one doesn't belong prompt. So this one shows 4 shapes. And so students are tasked with choosing one of those shapes that seems different than the others, but they have to tell which one doesn't belong, and they have to use mathematics to tell why. So it doesn't matter which of those figures a student chooses, They need to be able to justify their response using mathematics to tell why it is mathematically different than the other shapes in that prompt. Now, a lot of times when I use a which one doesn't belong with students, I use it to introduce a concept or at the very beginning of a lesson. And I often have my students engage in a turn and talk, share their choice, and tell why before we share with the entire group to find out what type of characteristics students uplifted or noticed about those shapes. So let's look at one of my other favorite routines is just a good old fashioned number talk. So here you see a picture of some goldfish. They're actually goldfish crackers. And so students are presented with the prompt, how many goldfish do you see and how do you see them? Usually I start out by giving students a couple minutes of think time so they can actually show how they counted them. Then I'll pose the question, how did you count the goldfish? So we can collect some data to see how different people counted them, and then find out if anyone counted them a different way so you can get as many different strategies as possible. And then usually my last question is to ask them, did anyone know there were 28 a different way? So I want to share some responses that some students shared. So you can see this is a student who actually started by finding tens and then used the leftovers as two groups of four. This is a student who skip counted by 7 to show the total. And the last one is another student who actually counted by tens, found the groups of 10, but then found a way to count the leftovers in a different way than the other group did. So lots of different opportunities for students to really see and appreciate the beauty and the differences in how others approach the same problem task. Obviously, we can tell that activities such as this really provide us with opportunities to uplift mathematical practice number 3, construct viable arguments, and critique the reasoning of others. Because we know for students to truly be engaged in this practice, they should be able to talk about math, use mathematical language to support or oppose the work of others. Let's take a look at a couple other routines. So now let's look at mathematical language routine number 3, critique, correct, and clarify. The purpose of this routine is to give students a piece of mathematical writing that is not their own to analyze, reflect on, and develop. Now, I know that some of you are working with pre-K or kindergarten age students. Remember, when we talk about mathematical writing, we're not talking about sentences and always words. Sometimes it's just their pictures that they've shown to respond to a prompt or a problem-solving task. The intent is to prompt student reflection with an incorrect, incomplete, or ambiguous written mathematical statement, and for students to improve upon the written work by correcting errors and clarifying meaning. So let's look at 2 ways you can do this. Having debate activities. So this is actually a problem task that I actually use with my students, and I put it in a debate journal. So you have 2 students were posed with a situation or scenario. One student wanted to add, one student wanted to subtract. And so your students are asked to decide which of these students is correct, to tell how they know using pictures, numbers, or words. So they get to use their journal to actually respond to the debate. Another way to do this is to actually have a mini classroom debate where one side of your classroom is labeled agree, one side is labeled disagree, and students choose their response and they use mathematics to justify or support their answer. Another example of this mathematical routine, and this would be for students who are a little bit older who are actually writing, is to use one of my favorite of all time children's literature books, How Big is a Foot? And so I pose this task to my students after reading the story is to write a letter to the king to explain why the first bed wasn't big enough for the queen. So they had to use mathematics to describe why this didn't work. Then they were given different papers to look at. And so in examining that student paper, they had to decide if they agreed or disagreed with that student's explanation, to tell why. And then if they wanted to, add something more if they felt the response wasn't complete. So there are lots of children's literature books that have mathematics that goes wrong, to think of it that way, that you could pose a task such as this for your students. And definitely a lot more books that are more recent than this actual story. One other instructional routine that many of you have probably utilized in your classroom are the would you rather prompts. So here you see a scenario. Would you rather have 3 pencils that are 9 centimeters each, or 5 pencils that are 6 centimeters each? Students choose an option, but they have to use mathematics to justify their reasoning. So somebody who chooses to have a bunch of the shorter pencils might say it has something to do with the amount of space that they have available, or the size of the storage container where they're going to store it. But they have to have some type of mathematics in their justification to support that answer. Another activity is one I'm going to ask you to engage with me a little bit. So if you have some paper and some pencil handy, get them out and let's do a little problem solving. So I'm going to age myself a little bit with this actual problem. My niece is now 15 years old, but when she was a little girl, she liked something called Shopkins. And so if you've never seen these things, they're these tiny little toys that get underfoot and probably drive all parents crazy. But she was obsessed with them. And being the good auntie that I was, I made sure she had plenty of them. So let's take a look at this problem. Jasmine collects Shopkins. She has more than 45, but less than 75. So jot down maybe a possible response of how many you think she may have. And now let's look at the next part. Keep in mind, we're going to advance through this a lot quicker than you would in the classroom, just because in the interest of time. So now we know that when she counts them by threes, she has none left over. So you should look at your estimate and see if you need to revise it based on this new information that you've received. So let's learn a little bit more about her Shopkins collection. When she counts them by fives, she has 2 left over. So once again, you have an opportunity to make some revisions. When she counts them by twos, she has none left over. So once again, students would have an opportunity to make some revisions. The number of Shopkins is more than half of 100. How many Shopkins does Jasmine have? Now, just for a point of reference, when I would do an activity like this with my students, I usually allowed them to work in groups of about 3, no more than 4. And so they could actually talk to each other as they were making those revisions. And then they would actually come up with their final response, and actually would allow them to use a strategy where they would actually go to visit other groups to find out what other groups came up with for their responses. So this, and I forgot, they, of course, would show their thinking and reasoning and their responses. This particular activity uses a strategy called mathematical bet lines. And so when we think about how some of our children sometimes feel a little bit intimidated when they see a story problem with lots of text, it's a way to have students actually gradually look at the information, have them think about what they know, what they need to know, what are all the details, and really help them to dissect those problems. Actually, this idea is started off in the reading classroom. So it was something that was used as key stopping points where teachers would ask students to dialogue about what they have just read and make predictions about the future. And so the authors, and you see the reference here from a Teaching Children Mathematics article, adopted this and made some adaptations to create mathematical deadlines. And so it really helps students understand and unpack those story problems by looking at that task in stages and having them make those predictions. So this is one that I usually like to do starting second half of the year, first grade, definitely with my second graders and definitely with third graders as they're beginning to see more and more of those problems that have text attached to them. One of the things as we start to wrap up our presentation is to remind ourselves we want to use routines, but we don't want to proceduralize them, where step one, you do this, step two, you do this. We really want to make sure our students are able to share authentic thinking. Supports are helpful, but we don't want them to be formulaic. We want to encourage and allow students to use their own words. So, what are some suggested next steps and resources that you can bring to your classroom experiences? One of my favorite tools to use to help with discourse is actually a math journal, because in the journal, students can record their math work and their thinking independently before they have to share it with someone else. They can use it to record their solutions to problems, strategies, and thought processes they use to arrive at the solution. It provides them with an avenue to organize, clarify, and reflect on their thinking in mathematics. And you, as the teacher, can use it as a formative assessment tool to inform classroom instruction. One of the ways I use journals in my classroom was to actually use it as a dialogue between me and my students. So, as my students responded to a task or a scenario, I would write prompts or questions or suggestions to them and maybe giving them another task that went with what they had already done, or posed a different question, or maybe suggested, can you try a different strategy, things of that nature. So it really became a resource tool and a conversational tool between the students and myself, so that we really could use it in a much more strategic way. In addition to learning how to do math, students must also learn how to articulate what they're learning in math. So, being able to record their thinking and receive specific instructional feedback from the teacher really helps students in achieving this goal. Most importantly, is we want to plan with the student in mind. So that means anticipating student solutions, thoughts, and responses that they might develop as they struggle, and planning ahead of time to generate questions that could be asked to promote student thinking during the lesson, and consider the kinds of guidance that could be given to students who showed one or another types of misconception in their thinking, and planning how to end the lesson so as to advance students' understanding. And I can't think of a better way to do this than applying the 5 practices for orchestrating effective mathematics discussions. So I have a reference to the resource here for that book. And it's one of my favorite things to use to plan and to orchestrate what's happening in day to day actions in the classroom. As a reminder, those 5 practices are anticipating, monitoring, selecting, sequencing, and connecting. And actually for those of you who are familiar with this resource, we know that there really is a practice 6, because that's the piece at the beginning where you're actually selecting your task and you're choosing those tasks. So thinking about those things and bringing protocols such as that to your planning process. So, what are some resources? This is the bit.ly that I said I would share with you, and it's simply Knighten, my last name, discourse, and resources all together. And so, capitalize on the first letter of each word. And so, these are a couple things that you might find handy to utilize in your classroom. This is a link to some sentence stems. These are helpful for a lot of reasons. One, for some students maybe who are stuck, they like having the structure of, okay, here's a suggestion of how I can get started. They can use this in conversation. So if they're having discourse and they want to know, how do I start my explanation? I've got these sentence stems here, or they can use it in writing in their journals. I know for my students, I had them placed in their math journals because those were always out when we were having math class. So they could flip to those pages and utilize those if they needed to have that sometimes. The next one are actually question stems for us as the educators. I know sometimes I got stuck in a rut. I would ask the same types of questions all the time. And so I found it really handy to take something like this and I would actually cut them up, put them on like a little ring so that I could look at them to remind myself, Latrenda, you need to ask this type of question. You need to ask that type of question. And so you may find this handy if you're trying to think about how can I ask different questions so that I'm helping my students to make connections among their ideas and applications. So there are a couple of question stems there that are suggested that you could utilize for that as well. What can we do as educators to support our students along this discourse journey? We definitely can encourage collaboration and promote dialogue among students, allow time for students to talk about mathematics, provide opportunities for problem solving, and incorporate problem posing into our classroom activities, and use tasks that rouse student interest and really allow students to make real life applications. There will be an opportunity after this recorded session for a live question and answer period. So make a list of any questions you may have, or maybe some things you just want to have discourse about during that question and answer period. And the last thing I want to do is thank you so much for joining me for this session. And I hope you were able to find some ideas either to support, enhance, or validate what you're doing with your students in your classroom. Thank you.
Good afternoon. How are you? First, I want to thank you for joining me for this session. And for those of you, some people express thanks for sharing some of these resources. And I see that there's some people who validate that they utilize a lot of these things as well. Dr. Seda mentioned that she includes these things in different parts of her lesson plan so that you're purposefully planning for discourse in the classroom. And there's one thing that I noticed when we are going through this session that my slides that showed how the goldfish were counted didn't show up. And so I will see if there's some way I can add those just in case someone wants to see some of those. So, are there any questions or is there anything that anyone wants to share with the group? Thank you, Ms. Thompson. Thank you. Ironically, that is a great question. Dr. Seda asked, she's thought about modeling some of the math language routines during teacher PD sessions. And have I done this with teachers and how has it gone? Actually, one of the things, and I'm in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. You guys may notice a Southern accent, possibly, maybe not, but I'm in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And so in my school district 2 years ago, we made a focus on numeracy for our math department. And so one of the things that we wanted to do definitely was to make sure that there was more student discourse, not just student to teacher, student to student, all around putting the students really on display. And so one of the things that we noticed is that we needed to have some structures in place to support our teachers along that journey. So we decided to uplift the math language routines because we knew that they would support all of our students. And so one of the things that I did was actually create some PD sessions for our teachers to use that were on demand using the MLRs, and so that they would just get that background information on them. And then the other things that I've done is very purposefully woven those into the PD sessions that I bring to our teachers. And one of the lessons that I learned was at first like, oh, here's this language routine. Here are these things you can do. Here's an example. And it was a bit overwhelming, not just for the teachers, really for me. So one of the things that I've learned is to take one or two and to place them into an existing session, but also use it in context with a strategy or with a specific lesson that they're getting ready to teach. And actually, tomorrow afternoon is a virtual PD day for our school district. And so I've selected just two of those eight that I'm going to use in the presentation that I'm doing tomorrow, just so that it's not as overwhelming. And then that way they have two that maybe they can connect with, and they can go back and utilize those in their classrooms. And ever since I started last spring doing just one or two in a discourse session and letting them experience it, I seem to have more people talking about them in their classrooms. So I think I'm going to stick with that strategy for a little bit until I learn something new, because that seems to have worked a lot better for our teachers. So thank you for that question. Does anyone have anything they want to share that works really well for them? I know you can't unmute and speak, but definitely we can share some things in the chat with each other that's going well for you with discourse where you are. The resources from this session are there's a resources section on the Summit website. And so actually they're found in two places. I think someone took the separate link. Someone asked about where to find the resources. So someone took the separate links and linked them there. But then also there is one link that says Knighten discourse routines. And so it looks like a Google slide deck, but it's hyperlinked and it has the resources that I reference in during the session there. So you can find all of those things there. So, once again, I would definitely want to thank you for this journey. And so, one of the things that was a little bit of a downfall is having a little bit of time for this discussion, because we know that this is something that's very important. So, one of the things that I would definitely suggest, if you have not picked up a copy of the five practices, or you have not used that resource in your classroom, I definitely suggest that you do. And there's another question in the chat, and I'm going to respond to that one in a minute. But in 2011, when the first version of this book was introduced to the math world, I was a classroom teacher. And initially, when I got this book, I'm like, five practices. I'm not sure what this is about. Then I began to read it. It's a quick read, it's an easy read, and it's very practical. And it completely changed how I taught. It completely changed how I organized discourse in my classroom. And I've always had a student centered classroom, because I like to attribute that to being an early childhood educator at the beginning of my teaching career. But it really made my classroom so much more teacher centered. So, Walanda, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. She says, how do you suggest that we start discourse practices with pre-K and K students? And so that is a great question. And so our students are naturally extremely verbal. One of the things I think that some of them do struggle with is learning, when is it my turn to talk as opposed to when it's someone else's turn to talk. So I think starting with some of those very, very what we think of as simple activities, those partner activities, because as we know that students at that age, they do much better when they're working with just one partner, and then eventually we may move them to working in threes. Sometimes, if we're brave, we may allow them to work in groups of four. And so I suggest starting with activities such as having them have set a timer. So here's this time, this is here. And a lot of people like to use music so they know when the music is going on, this is a quiet time. So you're thinking, so maybe they're drawing their picture or they're working with their hands on manipulatives to create something. So then when the music stops, then you turn to your partner and you get a chance to share. And this is where we bring in, what are those rules for listening and talking to others? In order to be a partner in a discussion, someone has to listen, and someone actually has to be the person who speaks and taking turns. And one of the things that I did create for young students when I first became a math coach and I was working with kinders, and I'm sorry I didn't include it as one of those resources, but My email address, I think, is listed somewhere in those resources. So please feel free to email me. I created something that was called a discussion spinner, and it wasn't anything earth shattering. All it does is it's a spinner because little kids like spinners. One side has an ear for listening, and the other side has lips for speaking. And so my kids spin, and if it lands on the ear, that means you are the first person who listens. And then the next person is the person who speaks. And then you take turns that way. And because for some reason, I seem to have the students who have difficulty managing. It's my turn, it's her turn, and I have to take turns. So we let the spinner make those decisions. And that's one of the reasons why we ended up with those steps for active listening on the table, is because it seems if we had a protocol for something, and my students had it there to look at and to read, that they felt, okay, we do have to follow these rules because this is our class protocol. This is how we're going to approach this scenario, and this is what we're going to do. So I think that that works very well. The title? I think, Tiffany, you're talking about the 5 practices for promoting productive discussions, facilitating productive discussions. It's referenced in the session. So I know this recording will be made available afterwards, and I put a picture there. But if you just put in 5 practices for math and Google it, you'll find it for sure. And I know for certain that there is a 25% discount going on at one of the publishing groups right now on that book. And let's see. Oh, you Tanisha shared something that I've experienced a lot, especially in my work with teachers. And you're located in DC, so hopefully I'll get to see you in October there. And so this is exactly, she mentioned that one of her barriers is the lack of purposeful discourse, and the pre-work hasn't been done. And so living in practice zero, but that's okay, because practice zero starts with at least knowing what your goal is, and then deciding that I'm going to select the task or the activity that I'm going to build that around. And so a lot of times I try to ask the teachers that I support to start with baby steps. So let's think about what is one component of what we're doing in this upcoming lesson. And you're right, it's the pre planning, it's that anticipation. And so this is the part that I love about 5 practices, because it forces you to really think about, just list what are some things that you might see students see and do. And the first time you ask teachers to do this, I know that some of them are going to look at you and they're going to say, oh, yes, like I have time to sit down and do all this practicing. But when you put that pre work in, it is so rewarding when they do that in the classroom. So a lot of times I'll go into like their grade level meeting or their PLC. And so we'll take like an upcoming lesson, and everybody, let's look at this lesson. What are some things you've seen kids do? What are some things that you've seen happen? And so I think we're getting our 30-second warning. And so we start with those baby steps. And so maybe we just work on that anticipation piece. How can we do that planning piece for the very beginning? Then we move to those next parts and start to put them together. And so, it takes those baby steps, but if they do it and they make a commitment to it for each day, it's so much more rewarding. And okay, so you'll be following Dr. Seda around, so that means I'll probably see you there. You guys enjoy the rest of the summit. Thank you.